Wind is the first character you meet in Glencoe. It is an ancient, untamed spirit that howls down the narrow, forbidding valley, sculpting the clouds and carrying the scent of peat smoke and salt from the distant sea. The town itself is less a town and more a cluster of stone cottages and slate-roofed buildings huddled beneath the looming, brooding mountains, the Three Sisters, as if seeking shelter from the sheer magnitude of the landscape. Rain is a constant here, not a visitor, but an eternal resident, cleansing the granite and making the moss-covered walls shimmer in the occasional shy sunlight. The air is always clean, biting, and smells of wet earth and pine, a scent that sinks deep into the bones and stays there, defining the local soul. This was the inescapable backdrop to Isla McKay's life, a landscape of fierce, breathtaking beauty that mirrored the intensity of her first great love and, eventually, the magnitude of her great despair. When Isla McKay first met Cameron McGregor, she was a bright-eyed artist, drawn from Edinburgh to the Highlands, seeking the dramatic light and stark solitude of the Eonac Ridge to sketch. Cameron was a brooding local man, born and bred in the Glen, with the kind of strong, calloused hands that spoke of hard, essential work, building walls, fixing engines, chopping wood, and a voice as deep and comforting as the Glen itself. He ran a small, artisanal tour company focused on the region's history, weaving tales of Jacobites and ancient battles with the geography. Their romance wasn't a gentle stream. It was a sudden, violent, wonderful flood. It was a connection rooted in the landscape itself. They found the same wild beauty exhilarating, the same isolation comforting. They married within a year in the small grey stone kirk, their promises exchanged beneath a sky threatening to burst with rain, with only a dozen close friends and neighbours witnessing the fierce commitment in their eyes. For the first 3 years, they were incandescent. They lived in a snug cottage built from rough-hewn local stone, right on the edge of Loch Leven, where the water was so dark and still it seemed to swallow the light and hold secrets. The small timbered studio Isla used for her landscape painting was just steps from the shoreline, a sanctuary filled with the scent of turpentine and oil paints. Their life was defined by mutual hunger, for each other's company, for the quiet shared dinners by the peat fire, and for the passionate heat they generated behind closed doors, a heat that defied the perpetual chill of the Highlands. They found profound joy in the small routines, Cameron leaving a cup of perfect strong coffee by Isla's easel every morning before dawn, Isla wrapping him in a thick wool scarf and kissing his frozen hands when he returned from a late tour. Their lovemaking was a silent language, a wild, untamed thing that left them breathless and tethered. Isla had never known such physical freedom, such an immediate and demanding recognition of her presence. Cameron treated her body like a piece of sacred art, tracing the curve of her hip, the sharp line of her collarbone, before taking her with a raw, almost desperate power that made her feel exquisitely seen, desired and fundamentally his. On cold, rainy nights, the sound of the wind was muffled by the thud of their shared passion against the thick old cottage walls, and the scent of rain-damp wool was chased away by the metallic musk of their shared skin and exertion. This was the fire, fierce and consuming, that kept the spiritual and physical chill of Glencoe at bay. But the fire, like all things burning too brightly in a closed space, began to consume its fuel. The decay was insidious, silent, and entirely domestic. It didn't arrive with a bang, but with the slow, almost imperceptible drift of 2 boats tied to the same dock, gradually being pulled apart by different, stronger currents. Cameron's tour business exploded unexpectedly with the rise of social media influence, turning him from a passionate guide into a stressed manager. His intensity was now directed outwards, towards projects, logistics, hiring staff, and late-night calls with booking agents in London. He was constantly busy, his sleep fractured, his temper quickening. He started speaking in acronyms and budgets, his deep voice losing its familiar, comforting resonance. Isla, who needed quiet and deep connection to fuel her art, began to retreat further. Her small success as an artist in Edinburgh required focused, solitary work, and she found the constant presence of Cameron's stress unbearable. She needed silence and space to paint, and he needed noise and distraction to escape the noise in his head. The quiet dinners became quieter, marked by the rapid tap-tap-tap of Cameron responding to emails on his phone. The conversation shifted from dreams and fears to utility. Did you pay the VAT? Who's ordering the coal? Who's taking the dog out? The shared laughter became brittle, easily shattered by a misplaced word or a sudden interruption. The physical hunger remained, a biological imperative, but it changed its nature entirely. It became mechanical, scheduled, a duty rather than a desire. It was less an act of devotion, and more a brief, necessary tension release for Cameron and a desperate plea for connection for Isla. The electric tension of their early years was replaced by a dull, predictable warmth, followed by immediate, lonely silence. They still loved each other, she knew that, a deep, foundational affection, but they no longer saw each other. They were living parallel lives in the same small space, their souls separated by an ever-widening canyon of unspoken resentments and fears, his fear of failure, her fear of being replaced by his work. The breaking point arrived not on an anniversary or during a major fight, but after Cameron missed Isla's small, local exhibition opening, a quiet show where she had bravely revealed some of her more emotional, abstract pieces. He had been stuck in Glasgow, dealing with a broken tour bus, and called 3 hours late, apologetic but exhausted, treating her disappointment as another logistical problem to be solved. The silence in the cottage that night was the sound of something irreparable finally snapping. One night in late October, the town was celebrating the closing of the main tourist season with a traditional end-of-season lock-in. Cameron, after weeks of relentless, brutal work, went to the Clasheg Inn with his colleagues, specifically seeking oblivion. He drank too much whiskey, a fierce, peaty local dram that sharpened his edges and violently dulled his judgment. Isla was home, nursing a persistent cold that felt like a physical manifestation of her depleted spirit. She was sketching a particularly stark image of the mountains under a winter moon, the sketch reflecting her own jagged emotional landscape. She felt a familiar, aching loneliness, intensified by the knowledge that he was deliberately choosing noise and company over her. Cameron returned well after midnight. The door opened with a sudden rough slam, letting in a gust of cold air and the aggressive smell of cheap synthetic perfume mixed with stale beer and the overwhelming scent of guilt. He stood in the hallway, swaying precariously, his usually kind, intense eyes glazed and unfocused, shadowed by a raw, naked terror. Before Isla could even formulate the question, the truth hit her, not with his words, but with the instant, overwhelming shame that flooded his face, burning away the last traces of the drunken haze like acid thrown in his eyes. "Cameron?" Her voice was a bare whisper, a thin, threadbare sound lost beneath the howl of the wind outside. He stumbled forward, collapsing not gracefully but heavily onto the arm of the worn leather sofa. His head was immediately in his hands, his broad, strong shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The sight of his brokenness was almost worse than the act itself. "I'm sorry, Isla. God, I am so sorry," he choked out, the words thick and slurred, yet devastatingly clear and agonizingly real. It was stupid. A moment. A mistake fueled by exhaustion and too much drink. With one of the new bar staff. I barely even remember what she looked like, but I remember. I remember what I did. What I destroyed. He couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a pall of thick, suffocating smoke. The infidelity was real, final, and irreversible. Isla didn't scream, she didn't cry. A strange, terrifying, glacial calm settled over her, a deep freeze protecting her from the immediate, catastrophic pain. The betrayal was less a shocking act, and more the final, devastating confirmation that the life raft they thought they were sharing had, in fact, been leaking and sinking for months, and now the water was over her head. "Get out," she said, her voice flat, devoid of human emotion. The calmness far more terrifying than any scream or rage could have been. It was the sound of a verdict being delivered. He looked up, tears streaking the grime and shame on his face. "Isla, please. It was a mistake. Let me explain. Let me show you. This is not who I am. We can fix this. We can fight for us." "There is nothing left to fix," she stated, standing tall, her small frame rigid with absolute unyielding finality. The marriage was the mistake. You just signed the divorce papers for me, Cameron. Go. He tried to argue, tried to beg, tried to cling to the memory of what they were, but Isla was a block of impenetrable ice. She waited in the living room, listening to the agonizing sounds of him stumbling through the bedroom, packing a bag clumsily, his movements punctuated by low, defeated moans. He left that night, not daring to look at her again. He packed his things, drove away, and the crunch of his tires on the gravel road was the sound of her world fracturing into a million glittering, painful shards. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of an immense, terrifying void. The ensuing months were a blur of cold legal paperwork and the agonizing process of dividing their shared life. Because they had made the conscious, mutual decision not to have children, the separation was clean on paper, swift and bureaucratic, but in reality it was messy, agonizing, and drawn out over endless, emotionless correspondence. They split the house. She kept the cottage, paying him a modest sum. The small savings and the memories, carefully portioning out their failed life like a coroner, separating remains for identification. Once the final paper was signed, Isla truly began to drown. The glacial calm broke, and the freezing water of grief poured in. The cottage on Loch Leven became her solitary prison, the heavy stone walls now suffocating instead of sheltering. She ceased painting entirely. Her studio, her sanctuary, became a room of accusation, the blank canvases screaming her failures back at her. The world outside the window, the magnificent, relentless beauty of the Scottish winter, now felt accusatory, too grand, too indifferent to her small, broken pain. The mountains seemed to mock her fragile existence. Depression was not a feeling, it was a physical weight, a cold, wet, suffocating blanket thrown over her mind, pressing her down into the damp earth until she felt she might merge with the peat. She would spend entire days curled up beneath the thick duvet, paralyzed, the faint, residual scent of Cameron's heavy wool sweater still clinging to the fabric, a phantom limb of her life. She stopped eating properly, surviving on cold slices of toast and lukewarm tea. She rarely spoke, often only managing monosyllables when the phone rang. Her only routine was the relentless, cyclical torment of her memories. The passionate, fierce wedding night contrasted with the chilling image of him leaving, sobered but ruined. His eyes pleading for a forgiveness she now realized he needed more than she needed to give. She suffered severe crises, moments of black, suffocating despair where the loch outside her window looked less like a body of water, and more like a vast, tempting final release. There were mornings when the physical act of sitting up took the strength of a Herculean task, and she would sink back, defeated by gravity and grief. Her few friends and neighbors, the kind, tight-lipped people of Glencoe who knew everything but said little, would bring soup and drop off groceries, leaving them silently on the doorstep like offerings to a hibernating, wounded bear. Morag, the elderly woman who ran the post office, would sometimes just sit with her, knitting in silence, offering a physical presence that asked nothing of her. A year passed. The grief did not lessen. It calcified, becoming a hard, sharp stone lodged permanently beneath her ribs, a physical reminder of her failure. It was during the second spring, 26 months after he left, that a change, so subtle it was almost missed, occurred. Isla had run out of milk. The need was purely logistical. She forced herself to leave the house, driving slowly towards the loch edge, where the light seemed strongest. She walked down to the loch one afternoon, compelled by the sudden need to feel the cold spray on her face. The sun, a rare and blessed visitor in the early Scottish spring, had broken through the heavy clouds, lighting up the mountainsides in a dramatic wash of gold, burnt orange, and emerald green. The air was sharp and clean. She stood there, shivering in her oversized coat, inhaling the damp, earthy air, and for the first time in 26 months, she didn't just see the loch as a symbol of her misery, a deep, dark reservoir of tears. She saw the perfect, still reflection of the sky, the clouds, and the high peaks, an image of vast, impersonal beauty. It was a fleeting moment, a tiny crack of light in the overwhelming darkness, but it was enough. The sight of the reflection was an anchor, a reminder that the world existed outside her pain. She started small, focusing on tasks with painful deliberation. First, she cleaned the cottage, throwing out not just the physical remnants of Cameron, but everything that smelled like old memory and stale regret. Old letters, mismatched hiking socks, a chipped coffee mug. Then, she forced herself back into the studio. She couldn't paint the beauty of the Glen yet. The joy was absent. Her first works were dark, abstract portrayals of her pain, swirling blacks, bruised purples, and angry reds, violent explosions of emotion on canvas, a way to vent the inner turmoil without speaking. But slowly, tentatively, as the days lengthened, the blues of the sky and the sharp greens of the highlands began to creep back into her palette, reclaiming the space. To truly break the cycle, she knew she had to leave the house and her immediate landscape of trauma. She started walking the trails she and Cameron used to hike, but this time she walked faster, further, alone, wearing thick layers of protection against the cold and the intrusive memories, pushing her body until the sheer physical exhaustion finally quieted the relentless, nagging voices in her head. She began to measure her recovery, not in days, but in the number of steps taken and the depth of the air she could inhale without feeling that crushing weight. She took a decisive step and contacted the Glencoe Heritage Centre. They were thrilled to have her help. 2 years and 3 months after the divorce, Isla found herself volunteering, finally forced to interact with people in a functional, non-emotional way, cataloguing local artifacts, carefully handling centuries of local history. It was a small way to reconnect with the community she had abandoned, a way to prove she was still a contributing part of the world. This is where she met Alistair MacLeod. Alistair was not the tempestuous, dark-haired figure Cameron had been. Alistair was a man built like a steady ancient oak, tall, fair-haired, with kind, thoughtful eyes the colour of the heather that covered the lower hillsides in August. He worked as the centre's head archivist and had a calm, patient demeanour that felt like a quiet harbour after Isla's 2 years in the storm. He knew about her history. In Glencoe, everyone knew everything instantly. But he never mentioned it. He simply treated her like a person, a colleague, not a tragedy or a fragile object. Their connection began over shared silence and dusty documents. He would bring her a cup of strong, sweet tea, made precisely the way she liked it, a small kindness she noticed immediately. He would wait patiently while she struggled to articulate a thought about a land deed or a family name, allowing her the space to exist without expectation, without demanding a performance of cheerfulness or recovery. They spent weeks researching a complex, centuries-old local legend about a lost clan treasure, finding a common, quiet purpose in the past. One crisp evening, they ended up staying late, laughing with genuine, uncomplicated delight over a surprisingly dramatic, almost soap opera-like land deed from the 17th century. He drove her home, and they sat in his old, reliable Land Rover outside her cottage, the silence between them now warm, comfortable, charged with a gentle, hesitant anticipation that felt entirely foreign and terrifyingly new to Isla. Alistair turned off the engine, plunging them into the deep Highland night silence, broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the loch waves. "I need to tell you something, Isla," Alistair said, his voice low and soft, not meeting her eyes but staring out at the dark loch. "I know you've been through hell, and I know I am not Cameron. I won't ever be, but I find myself wanting to see you laugh more than anyone I've ever met." Isla's breath caught, a sharp intake of cold air. The raw, open honesty stunned her. She didn't want to talk about Cameron. She wanted to move forward, and Alistair understood that by naming the history, he was helping her close the book. She reached out across the center console and placed her hand over his, which was resting lightly on the gear stick. His skin was warm, rough from work, a palpable, grounding presence. "I don't need another Cameron, Alistair," she replied, her voice steady and clear, a testament to her healing. "I need a friend, and maybe something steady. Something built on quiet mornings, not wild nights." He turned finally, his eyes searching hers, recognizing the vulnerability and the profound residual fear beneath her composure. He leaned in, not with the quick, forceful passion of her past, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness, as if allowing her every single moment to retreat or change her mind. The kiss was everything the Highlands were, gentle at first, like mist on the morning grass, then deepening, infused with a profound, unhurried warmth. It was a kiss that tasted of tea, honesty, and the enduring promise of rest. It wasn't fireworks. It was the quiet, comforting glow of embers. Their romance blossomed slowly, steadily like the fern that patiently unfurls its fronds in the spring, refusing to be rushed. Alistair gave her the invaluable gift of time. He took her on long walks, not to conquer the mountains, but to simply sit and watch the way the light changed on the water, showing her the world could still hold beauty without emotional cost. He taught her that true connection wasn't about demanding drama, but about the quiet comfort of the hearth, knowing someone was always there. But Isla still carried the heavy armor of 2 years of pain. She had moments of panic, sudden walls of ice she threw up between them. She cancelled dates. She retreated into silence. It took months for her to let him see the fear, the lingering self-doubt that whispered she was still too broken, too damaged and too unlovable to be fully embraced again. Alistair never pressured her. He would simply step back, wait, and then return the next day with a book he thought she might like or a perfectly brewed thermos of coffee. He was the safe shoreline she finally allowed herself to approach. The night she finally invited him fully into her life, they had spent the evening talking, sharing stories about their childhoods, peeling back layers until their histories lay bare. The sky outside was startlingly clear, revealing a dense canopy of stars above the glen, a rare and magical sight that felt like an auspicious sign. In the small, familiar bedroom of the cottage, everything felt new and consecrated by patience. Alistair moved towards her with a reverence that was both humbling and intensely erotic. He didn't rush. He peeled away her self-imposed layers of defense, like the delicate petals of a high mountain flower, his touch exploring, validating every curve, every shadow, and every scar she thought made her imperfect or unlovable. He held her face in his large, warm hands, his thumb tracing the shadow beneath her eye where exhaustion and pain had once lived. "You are magnificent, Isla. Whole. Don't ever let the past tell you otherwise. You are resilient beyond measure." When their bodies finally merged, it was an act of profound, tender healing. It wasn't the frantic, demanding heat of her youth, the kind that quickly burned out, but a slow, sensual, deeply connected communion. It was a merging of two souls finding peace and a fierce, adult recognition of mutual, understood desire. His hands, tracing the lines of her healed wounds and resting against her spine, were deliberate and reassuring. He moved with a rhythm that honored her body's cautious responses, drawing out pleasure until it became an almost unbearable, ecstatic release. A release not just of physical tension, but of 2 years of emotional repression. She cried, not from pain or regret, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that she was capable of feeling such intense, uncomplicated joy and safety again. The feeling was electric, a current of pure life flowing between them, confirming her absolute revival. Afterwards, lying tangled in the soft wool sheets, with the starlight filtering through the thin curtains, Isla finally spoke the words she had refused to acknowledge for 2 long years. "I thought I would die of the pain," she whispered into the darkness, her head resting on Alistair's steady chest, listening to the solid beat of his heart. "I genuinely thought a broken heart was a physical, fatal condition, that I was meant to wither here." Alistair didn't offer a shallow platitude or try to fix the memory. He simply kissed the top of her head, his breath warm against her hair. "It feels like it, I know, but the human heart is the most resilient muscle, Isla. It breaks, it shatters, but it doesn't stop beating. It remembers what it's like to love, and it demands patiently to be filled again." Years passed, years marked by stability and shared purpose. The moss grew thicker on the stones of the cottage. Isla's depression became a painful, distant memory, a chapter of her life she had survived, not a cage she still inhabited. Her art flourished, her paintings now capturing the light and shadow of Glencoe, with a depth and maturity she hadn't possessed before, her work selling steadily in Edinburgh galleries. She and Alistair bought a slightly bigger, older house overlooking the town, a warm, welcoming place with a massive stone hearth. They had no children, finding fulfillment in their shared, quiet life, their deep friendship, and the enduring, passionate love that was built on understanding and respect, rather than mere initial, unsustainable heat. One summer morning, several years into their life together, Isla was sipping tea on the porch, watching the mist slowly burn off the high peaks of the Three Sisters. The air was calm, the sun warm. Alistair came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The smell of his skin, a combination of soap, wool, wood smoke, and paper dust, was her constant, comforting anchor. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he murmured, tightening his embrace. She leaned back into his solid embrace, feeling the simple, profound truth of her existence. The deep, unforgiving lock of her grief had long since receded, leaving behind a fertile, settled ground where something new and immeasurably stronger had grown. "I'm just thinking," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, undeniable joy, "that the stories are completely wrong. You absolutely do not die of a broken heart. You just have to learn how to live again while it heals, and sometimes the second love is the one that teaches you how to breathe." The wind, the ancient, restless character of Glencoe, whistled past, carrying the sweet scent of summer heather, a sound that no longer felt like a lament, but a steady, hopeful song. This was her happy ending. Not a miraculous rescue, but an earned, deliberate survival, witnessed by the majestic, indifferent mountains that had seen it all before. She had lost the wild, consuming fire, but gained the enduring, comforting sun.